Hello everyone, this is Dr. Mark Opler speaking. I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Andrew Cutler. Dr. Cutler, if I could trouble you to give our listeners a brief personal introduction, tell them a little bit about how you got into our field, what your research focus is, and why it matters, what it is about our work that inspires you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, first of all, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So just by way of introduction, I have always wanted to be a doctor. My father was actually a physician, and I grew up loving biology and science. I really also loved detective stories like Sherlock Holmes and even Encyclopedia Brown, which when I was really young. So when I went to medical school, I really imagined myself going into internal medicine, which I saw as detective work. You know, you get the data and you make the diagnosis, which is like solving a mystery. But a funny thing happened throughout med school. I realized that parts of the body were not as exciting. For instance, the heart, I learned, was sort of a pump with wires stuck in it, and the lungs were bellows, and the kidneys were filters. And then I took neuroscience and neuroanatomy, and I realized that the brain is really the most interesting organ in the body. And I realized that there were still many mysteries to unravel with the brain. And so I was really leaning towards something to do with the brain. And then, of course, when I did my clinical rotations, and I realized a lot of internal medicine was following algorithms and didn't really seem to involve a lot of creativity. But then when I did my psychiatry rotation, I really fell in love with psychiatry and especially brain chemistry. And at the time, this was kind of the dawn of the modern psychopharmacology era. So I was really excited about these new developments and these new medicines that were coming out that seemed to promise even better efficacy and safety. So I decided, I was at the University of Virginia at the time, and I decided to do a combined residency. They had a combined internal medicine psychiatry residency, and I ended up getting board certified in both internal medicine and psychiatry. And then along the way, I also did research training on dopamine receptor pharmacology. My mentor was using animal models to look at psychosis and schizophrenia. And that got me into research. And I always really wanted to do research and be a professor. That's where I saw my career going. So I started out my academic career at the University of Chicago doing psychopharmacology research. And I realized, this was the mid-90s, that it was really difficult being junior faculty. And I really was kind of overwhelmed with all the different things I had to do. and my research kept getting sort of put on the back burner, and there was so much bureaucracy, it was hard to get studies going. So I actually was recruited to a hospital in Orlando, Florida that had a psychiatry division and wanted to do clinical trials. So I went there and started doing clinical trials privately. And my goal here was to have academic quality research, but in a private setting using the streamline and the best business practices, less bureaucracy. That was a time I really caught a wave, because that was a time when a lot of pharmaceutical companies were looking at doing research in private settings. They had mostly done it in academic settings. So it was one of those lucky right place, right time kind of things. And since then, I've really been fortunate to do a lot of clinical trials on a variety of medications. And I'd say that my primary research focus has been really an outgrowth of my dopamine receptor research. And so the four areas clinically that really involve dopamine dysregulation that I've done work in and published in are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and ADHD. As far as why this matters personally to me and why it inspires me is not only the patients I've met along the way, but I actually have several family members with mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder and ADHD, and have always been fascinated by the behaviors and the impact that it's had. And some small part of me hopes, of course, to find great treatments to help family members and others.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Cutler. I certainly appreciate the importance both of being at the right place and right time, but to quote another great thinker, fortune favors the prepared mind, and it sounds as though there you go. It sounds as though that played no small part in the path that you've chosen. So thanks
Well,
for sharing
along
that.
the way, my other platitude is I'd rather be lucky than good sometimes. So I've had a lot of luck along the way.
It certainly doesn't hurt. Let's go on. I wanted to ask you another question, if you don't mind. And
Sure.
this one is about the challenges that our field is facing.
hmm
Specifically, what do you see as the top three challenges in our current trial methodologies and the execution of studies? What are the three biggest challenges you feel that we're facing
hmm
right now?
Well, I think the challenges grow out of the fact that having done this now, this is actually my 26th year of doing clinical trials. Trials have gotten a lot more complicated, and some of it by necessity, of course, but some of it for other reasons. And of course, new technologies have been introduced. And so the problem that we have, especially in CNS drug development, is separating drug from placebo, which is a necessary requirement in the United States to get drugs FDA approved. And I see a lot of issues with that. The basic issue is what we're trying to do here is separate signal from noise. We're trying to detect a signal and minimize noise. And over the years, what has happened, not only in the US, but across the world, is we're seeing placebo response rising. The problem in the United States, though, is it's a double-edged sword. We're not only seeing placebo rise, we're actually seeing drug response drop. And so obviously when those two converge, you don't separate from placebo. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And I've written some articles on it, actually. But I think the issues have to do with a couple of things, since you're asking me to name a top three challenge. One of them, of course, is to identify the appropriate patient, and even more than that, the appropriate biologic target for your potential intervention. And the problem in psychiatry is the brain is so darn complicated, and we're forced to use diagnoses that are clinical diagnoses and not necessarily biologic targets. And so over time, I've seen many really interesting and unique drugs with unique mechanisms fail because they're probably working well for a subset of people with this clinical condition. For instance, schizophrenia, I like to say, is not schizophrenia, it's the schizophrenias. There's probably many different pathologies here. And so it's not always a failure of the drug, it's a failure of our ability to select the right patients that actually have the biologic target we're looking for. So that I would see as one of the top challenges.
Right.
Next, I would see a big challenge we have is in minimizing noise. The problem is, of course, that as people have been chasing this smaller signal, if you will, or smaller separate from placebo, they've done things like ramped up the number of patients and the number of sites that are needed in a study. And there, of course, you're actually paradoxically introducing more noise and maybe making it even harder to detect. The other thing along those lines is that as we've had a lot of issues with payers for new treatments and getting new treatments paid for, companies are very cognizant now. They're thinking even earlier in their development programs of how do we start generating data that's going to help us get this medication paid for in the marketplace, which is a very reasonable thing, and also marketing considerations. So you get people adding various measures such as quality of life and healthcare economics and things like this. And again, what we're trying to do is to detect a signal, and the more of these kind of outcomes and variables that get put in and the more rating scales, the more potential noise gets into the system. So that's something that I think about and worry about as well. So I think those are, if I've mentioned three, I guess there is another important challenge, and that is integrating technology. The technology is evolving so rapidly in our society in general, but especially as it relates to medicine, healthcare, and clinical trials. And I like to say, we all know technology is going to change what we do in clinical trials. We just don't know how yet. So there's a variety of these emerging technologies that I think people are struggling to figure out. How much of this do we incorporate? Where do we use it? Things like that.
Absolutely. Just to shift gears a little bit, could you share with us a couple of the developments in clinical research of the past year? It's been a remarkable past 12 months. What are the developments of the past 12 months that you think are most exciting? And why do you think they will have an impact on the lives of our patients?
Well, I have to agree with you. I like to say that the past year or two is the most excited I've been about clinical trials in CNS and psychiatry since I got started all those years ago. It seems that finally the industry had sorted itself out a little bit. For a while, we went through this problem where large pharma was starting to walk away from CNS and psychiatry trials, and we were starting to move towards smaller biotechs and mid-sized companies. And I think the financing and who's doing the research has sorted itself out, and also the technology's evolved to where we've had some significant developments. And just a couple of things that I've been thinking about include the development of technology such as wearables, which allows you to collect so much more data in a less intrusive way, as far as a patient's activity level when they're sleeping, and even things like monitoring your cell phone usage to see how often are you on social media, how many phone calls are you making, which can talk about, are you getting more active, are you having meaningful social interactions, quality of life, are you walking more and getting off the couch. So to me, wearables is a big one. That of course is going to revolutionize not only research but people's lives, just like social media has. As far as specific medication developments, the two areas that are really hot right now that I'm real excited about is in the field of depression. For a long time, we focused on medications that are basically ways to manipulate the three classic monoamines, which is serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And we've gone at various ways, such as reuptake inhibition or binding to receptors. But, our treatments have not worked well for a lot of patients. And just finally, in the past year or two, we've had some very positive data come out on a couple of really very different mechanisms. One of them is a ketamine kind of drug, S-ketamine, which is inhaled nasally. And this is working through the glutamate system, a totally different chemical. And that's a company, Janssen has that, but other companies have other kinds of glutamate-type ketamine-like drugs, if you will. The other is a company called Sage, which has a drug that's working on GABA-A receptors. And glutamate and GABA are the two predominant chemicals in our brain. Glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. Both of these treatments have been shown to have rapid effects, rapidly effective. I'm talking hours, if not a day or two. And traditionally with the monoamine medications, you have to wait several weeks, 2 to 4 weeks to see anything. So I'm really excited about this possibility of helping a lot more patients and helping them faster, if you will, to start getting better. The other area, as far as a therapeutic area that's really exciting to me right now, is schizophrenia. And there was recently announced very positive results on a study with a very different mechanism of action, a drug that actually works through receptors called TAR1 receptors, which are trace amino acid receptors. This is a chemical system in the brain that has only recently been discovered. Even in schizophrenia, most of our drugs are working exclusively or predominantly through dopamine, and there's a lot of consequences of that. So our hope has been to find new targets as well. So, again, trying to find these new targets and new mechanisms to help more people who aren't as well helped by our traditional medicines, and maybe even improve upon tolerability and safety. That's really what's exciting to me right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, that certainly echoes what I've heard from a number of other luminaries in the field. And recently, one of them made a comment to me that, in evolution, there's this concept of punctuated equilibrium, that we go through these periods of stasis followed by periods of intense evolution and activity.
Yeah.
Does it feel as though we're entering one of those new, busy, highly active stages of psychopharmacology now, where old assumptions are being thrown away, new paradigms are coming to light that are totally changing the way we think about treatment of psychiatry?
Absolutely true. There's one other quick thing I did forget to mention. In the past 2 years, in 2017, we had 2 new drugs approved to treat tardive dyskinesia. And this is very personally important to me because I've worked with schizophrenia for so long, and I used to run a Clozaril clinic. And, it was terrible to see patients develop this permanent movement disorder called tardive dyskinesia, which is a consequence of our antipsychotics. We had nothing to treat this for. Essentially, 1950 was the first dopamine-blocking antipsychotic chlorpromazine. And from 1950 to 2017, which is 67 years, we had nothing to treat it. And these work through a very interesting mechanism called VMAT2 inhibition. And why this is important is because this is actually an intracellular transporter. Most of our medicines work on the outsides of cells, if you will, and this one works inside. So it's yet another exciting development, new mechanism of action that opens the door to possibilities.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Let me ask you this. I mean, we've talked about the past year. We've talked about the past challenges.
Mm-hmm.
What's coming next?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, just to focus the question a little bit, what do you see as the top 3 opportunities in clinical development in neuroscience?
Yeah, well, in addition to, I think, further developing this idea of rapid onset, rapidly active antidepressants, I think we have to refine that quite a bit. We need ones that are ideally taken orally and have less risk and toxicity. Some of these rapid treatments now are intravenous, for instance, or in the case of the S-ketamine, intranasal. So it'd be nice to continue to have more of those. Another would be, we have just a huge need for just the treatment of schizophrenia in general, and particularly the symptoms that are especially the most impairing are what's called negative symptoms and cognitive impairment. And these are the symptoms that keep someone from meaningfully engaging socially or occupationally. And schizophrenia is an especially pernicious illness because it hits people in their late teens, early 20s, right when they're getting ready to launch and enter life and develop. And so this is an illness that really affects people for their entire adult lives. And so I'd love to see more there. And I think, again, as the science is evolving, we may be getting somewhere there. I was recently an advisory board with a company that has developed a new medicine, which is actually in front of the FDA right now, that has some very interesting intracellular mechanisms and may indirectly be affecting the glutamate system again, which so it works on dopamine, serotonin, but also glutamate, and that may help some people who haven't been helped with schizophrenia. So depression and schizophrenia, but the other one is in the ADHD field, which is another area of interest of mine. What the world needs, I like to say, is a non-stimulant that actually works reliably, because we do have stimulants that are very effective, but of course they come with significant baggage and risk.
Right.
Things like abuse and diversion, but also significant cardiovascular risk. And there are a couple of non-stimulants in development that I'm kind of excited about. So those are some of the areas. I guess there's another big need, and that is bipolar depression, where right now we only have 3 medications FDA approved. We have many approved to treat mania, but as far as the depression, and bipolar disorder is an illness predominantly of depression, actually, more depression, recurrent depression, and that's what holds people back. So we really need more effective treatments and more options for the depressive phase, in particular bipolar, I think.
Well, thank you for that. That certainly gives us a very good sense of the landscape. To finish up, let me ask you about your predictions for the next 12 months. As you said, the last 12 months or so have been just intense and exciting. What's happening next? What do you think will surprise us? What do you think the focus of our field may shift to? And are there particular programs that you're excited to see read out, one way or another, in the next 12 months?
Well, I think continuing on the theme of rapid-acting antidepressants, there is a program with a compound called rupastanil that a company called Allergan has that works on the NMDA glutamate receptor, which is where ketamine works, but in a very different part of the receptor. And the problem with ketamine, people may realize, is that it can cause psychotic-like symptoms and dissociative symptoms, so-called PCP-like reaction. But because this drug is working at a different site, it does not seem to cause those side effects. And I was involved in that program, and we saw some just dramatic improvement, dramatically effective antidepressant effects with people. So I'm certainly hopeful that might read out positively, because a lot of money was invested into this program. And a lot of work was put into this, and I'm hoping that we can show that these large-scale programs can be positive, that we can develop these new medications. So that's one area. The other area is in the area of something I haven't talked about yet. I've talked a little bit about technology, but there's an area that I've been involved with from very early on, and it's called digital therapeutics. And what that means is actually digital treatments, digital interventions. And one that we're working on, and again for ADHD, is a therapeutic video game, if you will. This is a video game that is developed based on principles of neuroscience that adapts as the child or even adult. This video game has actually been used for ADHD, but is also starting to be looked at for autism and for adults with Alzheimer's dementia. So as the person interacts with the game and plays the game adapts and gets a little harder, a little more challenging. And theoretically, what you're doing is training the brain and developing and strengthening circuits of attention and potentially inhibition of unwanted impulses. And so it's almost like you're working out your muscle. You lift weights, you work out your muscle, you can gradually lift more and more, your muscle gets stronger and bigger, this kind of thing. So I'm very excited about that kind of possibility. This is something that I like to call going beyond the pill. For so long we've thought of treatments and medications as pills, but obviously we can administer now medications intravenously, intranasally, patches, various ways. But also, potentially, we can have interventions and treatments that are digital and not a pill or not a medication. So those are a couple of areas that I'm most excited about, and they're not that far off. These are things that are coming right now. And I guess, again, this area of wearables that just fascinates me. You know, for years we've been using these clunky watches that people wear that they're called actigraphy or actimeters. That look like they came from Back to the Future, you know, DeLorean strapped to your wrist. They're very clunky. But now we have these sleeker things you can wear, but also monitoring. People now have such a personal interaction with their cell phones. They come with us everywhere. We are interacting with them constantly. And so there's a wealth of data and information there that we can use that may lead to further treatments, further ways of monitoring the effectiveness of our treatments. Maybe unlock some more of the clues and mysteries of how the brain works.
Very exciting stuff. And you know, I feel as though I have to say this. I couldn't agree more with your conclusions. You know, I heard the some of the results on some of the recent digital medicine programs, and just the potential that they're unlocking is just enormous. I also think we almost need to start thinking of the cell phone, the smartphone, as another organ.
Yes.
That can tell us a lot about the health of the individual. That's how things are evolving. Well,
one other quick thing as far as technology. There's a technology that is actually not brand new, but is being used increasingly, and that's a technology that assists in measuring improvement on medications that may detect changes even before the patient or the person notices anything. And one of those is facial recognition software. And this is Dr. Catherine Hamer and Guy Goodwin's lab in Oxford, but there's others working on this, where patients who are depressed have something called negative cognitive bias. And so everything just seems more negative. And if they look at a picture of a face that's neutral, not really happy, not really sad, they will overinterpret it as sad or anxious more often, and they may misinterpret it that way. Now, if someone is given an antidepressant or medication that is going to be effective, that reverses and they can more accurately identify the emotion of the face within a day or two, well before they notice feeling better or anything else is seen. And so I think about the potential for this to identify someone who is responding or potentially going to respond well to a treatment early on, and then you can stay on the right track. And maybe if they're not responding, rather than having to wait and potentially have the illness progress, maybe we can switch treatments and do something else. Other way of applying this is something I heard about a couple of years ago, where computers can analyze the prosody of people's voices and accurately predict if someone is going into a depressive episode or becoming psychotic. So potentially we can catch people before they slip into a serious mental state that makes it harder to treat, and maybe do things even ideally prophylactically or very early on to prevent negative consequences. So those are the challenges and the exciting things I see.
Dr. Cutler, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and on behalf of myself and my listeners, thanks again, and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Me too. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today.